In terms of China, of course, which has got a lot of coverage, we have got a protocol in place. The Chinese government have put in place public policy settings that we think are well matched to the protocol. They're focused on the development of the beef production sector and increasing production scale, as well as reflecting increasing complexity in consumer markets. Of course, the challenge for us is that the Chinese, whilst we've agreed to the protocol, have put additional conditions on the process of importing cattle, and some of those are pretty difficult conditions, and that's why we've only seen just a few air freight shipments at this point in time. But the industry does remain hopeful that we will be seeing larger shipping consignments to China in the very near future. We also, in terms of sheep, remain determined to find an acceptable way forward to resume our trade with Saudi Arabia. It's worth noting that in the absence of any Australian livestock, Saudi Arabia is currently importing 8 million head annually from markets like Sudan and others in North Africa, but has indicated strong interest in a sizable intake of Australian livestock annually. I'm confident that we can find a solution that not only respects Saudi sovereignty, but is also consistent with welfare assurance requirements, international OIE animal welfare standards, and Saudi Arabia's own animal welfare laws. There's two more threats, two more challenges I'll deal with. Next one is regulatory threats, and I want to take a few minutes to talk about these, because these are a real impediment, and this is also an expression not only of the live trade, but I think more broadly of some of the challenging regulatory requirements that exist in the red meat sector. But before I get started, my comments should in no way be taken to suggest ALEC is arguing against SCAS. Indeed, we're on the public record as supporting the SCAS pillars as a means to delivering trade sustainability, which includes improving animal welfare. But in large part, the most significant changes to the regulation of the trade have come from crisis events. The 2003 Cormo incident saw the introduction of the Australian standards for the export of livestock. Despite the Cormo incident occurring as a result of political issues, not a failure to meet importing country requirements, nor a failure of the industry's then QA program, the media storm it created led to increased regulation of the industry. In 2006, the trade was banned after a 60 Minutes report on conditions at the Basatine abattoir in Cairo, until regulations were implemented limiting exports to closed-loop supply chains in that country. 13 years later, the ABC's A Bloody Business Story led to the introduction of SCAS. It's a moot point to argue whether the government should have responded as they did, and I will address why I think they did a bit later. But the consequences of their action deserve scrutiny. The question remains whether regulation set at a time of crisis, perceived or real, is fit for purpose today. It's one thing to set regulatory parameters that reflect community expectations. It's another to regulate on the basis that another crisis is just around the corner. SCAS in particular has added the most significant regulatory burden and cost to the job of exporting. Put in the context that Australia is the only country requiring exporters to have oversight of livestock to the point of slaughter, it should shine a spotlight on the need for efficient and effective regulation that is not overly burdensome and anti-competitive. Industry's achieved a variety of reforms to SCAS in the last 2 years to better streamline processes, which industry thanks the government. These reforms have gone some way to reducing red tape and limiting regulatory costs, but there's more that can be done without compromising the pillars of SCAS. The Productivity Commission's inquiry into regulation of agriculture has provided a timely opportunity for industry to step back and take a deeper look at the regulatory system and opportunities for further reform. This process, which has been undertaken over the past few months, has highlighted some deep flaws in the regulatory framework underpinning the trade. These flaws go to the manner in which regulation of the trade has been crafted, from successive alterations to the ALEC Act and the Exporter Control Act. The findings are outlined in both the ALEC and LiveCook submissions to the PC Productivity Commission, but in summary they show that the legislative framework lacks clear objective settings for the role, expectations and scope of the operation of the trade. As such, the regulator has almost unlimited and unfettered discretionary powers, allowing for significant regulatory creep. The legislation is drafted in such a manner that it expects infallibility or perfect performance, effectively zero risk, by the exporter, which has enabled SCAS and exporters' performance to be labelled as a failure, and good performance and improvement against reasonable standards and a duty of care to go unnoticed. The legislation applies strict liability and secondary liability to exporter non-compliance, setting up again the exporter to fail, and allows exporters to face de facto sanctions where evidence is circumspect or unproven at best. In summary, the legislation and regulation governing the trade does not meet the government's own rules for good regulatory practices and has, in estimates provided through an analysis undertaken by EY, added an extra $22.3 million per year in additional regulatory burden on exporters. The fact that this figure is largely borne by about 15 to 20 companies should be enough to provoke an immediate rethink, or at least a move within the context of the review of Export Control Acts to make substantive reform. Now, I want to now talk about social licence, because I don't think you can talk about the live trade, I don't think you can talk about challenges, and I don't think you can talk about our future if you don't talk about social licence. I think the trade's public support or lack thereof is possibly the greatest threat to the industry. Now, there's a seesaw that levers between social control and regulation and accountability. In my view, the more accountable you are, the more trust you build and the less pressure there is on regulatory control. And while there's reasonable optimism about economic opportunities for the trade, the biggest threat remains the industry's capacity to have support from the Australian public. Support for the trade cannot be argued, however, simply on economic grounds. There's no trade-off. You have to have good welfare. You can't trade off welfare with the fact that we employ over 13,000 people, and some people who want to carry that argument, I don't support it. Animal welfare is part of the future of the trade. It's a core basis of the trade. It's good business, good animal welfare. So economic returns are at risk if the trade is threatened by public and political displeasure at the industry's performance. So what are the factors influencing community views about the live trade? For much of the history of the trade, the prevailing challenge has been to provide livestock for a reasonable profit. This was, for many years, largely accepted by the community. But in recent decades, Western societies have become more aware and sensitised to animal welfare concerns. This is often expressed locally by increased media prominence and public outrage towards cases of cruelty. While social changes have matured, the livestock export industry did not. The industry continued on the premise that it's supplying a legitimate need with a legitimate product in an economically viable and important way, and with reasonable welfare within the boundaries of its control. This was the view of the industry up to 2011. The problem for exporters was, of course, that what had been reasonable and unnoticed upon in the past is now not only broadly considered unreasonable and trailing average social expectations, but is now seen as unconscionable and intolerably cruel. The visualisation of cruelty in this context, aided by the advent of social media, has been a very powerful tool by activists driving straight at the gap between industry performance and community expectations. Now, some believe that activists are exploiting the negativity about the industry from past practices and not giving credit to the enormous changes made and is continuing to make. Others believe the moral campaigning by highlighting incidents of animal cruelty as a norm is simply about fundraising, rather than an actual commitment to animal welfare improvement. I do not subscribe to any of those views. I want that made very clear. So can industry overcome the challenges that we've got? I think we can. We can with time and we can with commitment. Exporters are a very ambitious bunch. They're rather entrepreneurial too, so they instinctively place few limitations on their success, although plenty of people outside the industry are trying hard to do so in their place. Few would argue that the growth in the trade since the shock of 2011 has exceeded all expectations, but the success won't continue if core issues are not addressed. And I make the point here, and I don't want to sound self-righteous, but the greyhound industry ban should send shockwaves across the ag sector. Now, if somebody wants to ask me what my views are after, I'm more than happy to share them. I won't share them right now. But if not only the live trade but other industries don't sit up and look at why that happened and what wasn't done to mitigate the risk of that happening, then they're heading down that same pathway. You have to deal with outrage. This concept that you can fix the problem, deal with the science, but not respond to the emotional feeling that comes with the issue, you're not fixing it. And I know that's hard for people, in the ag sector, they want to get on and do things. I've kind of, looking at 2011 and looking at what we just did with the Vietnam incident. In 2011, industry knew there was a problem. So what did they do? They went to do the technical fix stuff. And they started talking about the technical fix when the community was just seeing the most horrific vision of animal cruelty. And so the industry was talking about, here, we're going to fix it, we're going to do this. They're just going, what the hell? And they're emotive. And there was communication of crossing over each other. What we tried to do with Vietnam, and I do say this very genuinely, is there was a lot of emotion attached to the most recent incident in Vietnam with the sledgehammer, because of the incredible amount of work that's gone up in that market to make improvements. There's over 120 approved abattoirs in that market. Many of them used to use sledgehammers. Now they don't. They all use stunning. And to see the animals outside the system after all of the work that's gone on, there was a genuine emotive feeling across the industry about that incident. That they felt let down themselves. They knew they'd let others down as well. So when we were talking about Vietnam, we were in the same space as the community. We were feeling outraged. We were upset too. So we weren't having the same crossover in terms of communications. I've sidetracked a bit there. Let me get back on track. So how can we overcome the challenges that we face? I mean, obviously we need to continue to drive for welfare improvements along the supply chain through an ongoing focus and investment in research, development and extension. We need to talk openly about our vision for animal welfare, one that's no fear, no pain, and how we are working towards this goal. We've not been good at telling the story of progress and change. Rather, often we've just popped our head up when it suits us and said, oh, look at us, we've got something new to say. That just doesn't work if you're not sharing that journey of change in the context you need to share it in.